Well, here we are again, and we're going to be looking at another Blackmore article. This one, Leading as Emotional Management Work in High-Risk Times, the Counterintuitive Impulse of Performativity and Passion. This was published in School Leadership and Management in the year 2004, and it represents a particular literature that emerged about that time, just about as many of these reforms started to really become prevalent across the world, essentially. And this whole discussion around emotions in organizations. It's an interesting discussion and an important one, as it turns out, as well, because it's something that exists, is pervasive, but we haven't talked about in the certainly in the academic literature, and probably haven't named in our own practices either. So let's look at what Blackmore has to say. In these high-risk times, what we find is the model that we discussed in the first Blackmore article, that is that center periphery kind of model, where at the periphery we have local risk and responsibility, and at the core, or at the center, we have central regulatory authority. And so out in that periphery, then, we have a group of educators who have a passion for meeting all of students' needs, and doing that in a way that is professional, that is caring, that is informed by good practices, and so on. At the core, we have performativity measures. That is, being seen to do what is required efficiently and effectively. So we have principles standing in the middle between these two demands. So at the periphery, a particular passion for working with kids and doing the best for them. At the core, these principles have to respond by being seen as performative, that is, acting out performativity in meeting the demands of those in authority. So these shifts in leadership practice as teaching was deprofessionalized became managing ideas, those things that came from the core to the school face, people who were expected to enact these policies and requirements of the organization, and the emotions that all of this, in many cases, turmoil engendered. So what are the effects of these high-risk times and these tensions between these two locations? Well, we have, first of all, a competitive model, and we've talked about that before. Principals who are not necessarily because this is their primary focus, but because they're required to, by the practices that are in place, to focus on image, and on financial issues, on personnel issues, on resource management issues, at the expense of educational leadership, because now principals are doing all those things that the larger organization used to do. And that allowed principals then to spend more time both responding to some degree to all of those things that were done at the board level, but spending more time working with teachers and students and creating a good school environment. We also have this passion to do good for others, which led to a kind of emotional labor for principals between these two different locations, of the kind of emotional labor of managing both their own and others' emotions in response to these reforms, which creates a kind of challenge, a real challenge, in fact, of care for others who are maybe struggling, who may be upset, who may be resistant, and so on, as well as their self-care in managing all of this. She talks, Blackmore talks as well about the necessity to practice subterfuge in some cases. When something comes down from head office that you're required to do that is going to, in fact, perhaps hurt your school. So how is it that you can protect your school while still being seen to implement what is expected of you? And so in some cases that requires some subterfuge to protect the school, but it has to be done in secret. And because it's being done in secret, and because publicly you're being seen to toe the line, This interrupts the trusting relationships that often characterized schools. So these demands for the economies and performance changed the emotional economy of the schools. It shifted from a collective that made decisions about what happened in schools to individual decision making, which led to, again, a lack of trust, some suspicion, some fear, some anxiety. So here we have this emotional cauldron of conflict and or the potential for conflict that principals needed to manage. It also impacted relationships with parents, where parents might be upset about a reform that had been imposed and having to steel oneself to present a cooperative front in support of those reforms while managing how parents were feeling about those reforms, and sometimes even sharing the parents' concerns, but having to control one's emotions in a way that were representative of cooperation with those who required implementing of the change. Collegial relationships between schools became competitive. They were characterized by performativity, and so those who had worked collaboratively together might find themselves in a position where if they work collaboratively, they might in fact challenge what's necessary to have that school move forward. So for example, a school might be planning some kind of initiative that's going to bring in more people from the community to that school. So it's a kind of marketing strategy. Whereas another school may not be doing that. To share that information with another school might be cooperative, but it might mean that you get fewer students, which may endanger, in fact, your school's viability to stay open. So these collegial relationships were then challenged. It redefined principals' professional responsibilities, where performativity was in conflict with allegiance to public schools. So you might have real concerns about a reform that's being imposed. You feel that it might actually endanger the viability of public schools. And in Australia, of course, this is even more of an issue because private and public schools are in direct competition with one another as private schools are more numerous. So you have this kind of conflict with allegiance to public schools and some reform that you're required to impose. And you need to act as a buffer to that change, yet still have to lead those changes. So this creates a kind of emotional tension. So in this article then, Blackmore explores these changes and in somewhat more detail than I'm going to present here, but this just sets up the kind of tensions between performativity and passion that she explores in this paper. So I hope this has been helpful to you.